these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast.
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I have a very special guest today, one that I've known for a long time. I think I've known him longer than he's known me. That's okay, and we'll get to why that is. We have Jocko Willink on the podcast. Of course, Jocko is himself a podcaster, might be more successful than mine. That's okay, I'm not jealous. But maybe if you guys would give me 5 stars and give me more reviews, then I could catch up to Jocko. But he has an amazing podcast. He's been doing it for a while. He's an extremely successful author. Of course, prior Navy SEAL, one of my instructors in various capacities, and we'll get into that. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, entrepreneur. I'm not sure how many businesses Jocko has at this point, but they're all very successful. You should go follow him wherever you can. Jocko, thanks for being on the podcast. Where can people follow you? Let's just get that out of the way right away.
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me. Good to see you. Yeah, you can follow me. I'm not real hard to find. It's at Jocko Willink, and that kind of pops up.
Not that many names. Not that many names like Jocko Willink. What is what is the origin of the name Jocko? It sounds like somebody would make that name up just to sound really tough.
So my parents gave me that nickname, and they gave it to me before I was even born. My real name is actually John, and my dad's name is John, and so they needed a nickname to call me around the house, and my dad wanted me to be a jock, and there was actually, surprisingly enough, there was a former OSS guy that was kind of famous back then, and my dad had heard of this guy and knew who this guy was, and his name was Jock, and so my dad nicknamed me Jocko. There you go.
I actually never knew that. I never knew your name was John. So I want to get into a few things in the short time we have. One is New Year's resolutions. I mean, you're a motivator, a speaker. People want to hear what you have to say when it comes to how to develop themselves better, become better leaders, become better people, become better fathers, mothers, coworkers, bosses, whatever it might be. This is what you do for a living. So we want to hear about that. Got a lot of questions from the audience because I put this blast out on Instagram last night, and there was actually a lot of good questions. People want to know how those principles apply to politics. I want to talk to you about our time in the military and where that overlapped, and maybe some recent news. The only thing I want to get into with you is some general discussion on military leadership failures. This is something you've talked about on your podcast extensively, and it's applicable considering what's happened this year or this past year in Afghanistan. And I just want to get your thoughts on that. But can we get to our time together? Give us a brief history for people who don't know you that well. You joined the SEAL teams what year?
So I joined the Navy in 1990, and I went right to BUD/S, graduated in 1991. Checked into SEAL Team 1. I was an enlisted guy at SEAL Team 1 for my first 8 years. Got picked up for the Seaman Admiral program, went to OCS, got commissioned, did a couple deployments out at Team 2, got done with Team 2, hadn't been to college. In order to be an officer, you need to go to college. So the Navy sent me to the University of San Diego. I did a few years at University of San Diego. That's when September 11th happened while I was in school. As soon as I got back to a SEAL team, I went to SEAL Team 7, and they were getting ready. They were in the barrel to deploy, so I deployed with SEAL Team 7. I was really lucky. I took over a platoon when I got there that was having some issues with their leadership, so I stepped in, took that over, did that tour to Iraq, came home, was the Admiral's aide for 13 months, working for Admiral McGuire, and seeing a lot of the bigger picture stuff that was going on in the community and getting a better understanding of that. And then I did a task unit commander at SEAL Team 3, deployed again to Iraq. This time was to Ramadi. Got done with that deployment. Came home, took over training the West Coast SEAL teams, TRADET, the training detachment, and did that for my last few years that I was in. And that's where I met you. And then I retired after that at 20 years.
So when you were at SEAL Team 3, leading task unit Bruiser was the was the nickname everybody gave to that task unit. So it's a pretty famous deployment in the SEAL teams. And we heard about it a lot because I was going through officer training. I was finishing BUDS, and then I was going through what we called JOTC, which was at that time led by Leif Babin, who, of course, you know. And he would bring you in as a speaker, and you'd look at us, you'd mead mug us, tell us how screwed up we were, because we were. And but it was all about that deployment, because that deployment, I think you draw, from what I can tell in your writing, you draw a lot of your leadership lessons from that deployment. It was an intense one. I mean, it was the Battle of Ramadi in 2006. This was the height of bloodshed in the Iraq campaign. So, how did that deployment change how you viewed leadership in the SEAL teams? Forget about leadership and everything you write about after that. I mean, how did that inform what you were telling me in the classroom, who had never seen combat before, never been in a team before? What were some of the eye-opening experiences and lessons that you derived that you would tell us?
Yeah, so I was very, very lucky in my whole career. My whole career was very, very lucky. Just the way it all worked out, the timing that I had, the fact that I was an enlisted guy for a long time during peacetime, but I wasn't just an enlisted guy, I was a radio man. So what does that mean? I was a radio man, so I was very lucky because now I was engaging in the planning with the leaders and watching how plans would come to fruition. And then I happened to do multiple amphibious ready group deployments where we were out with the Marines. I did 2 of those deployments on the West Coast where I was now working with the Marine Corps, working with battalions and their air assets and the surface assets from the Navy. So I had all this interoperability, and I was just really exposed to a lot of stuff. In my first platoon, I was the only comms guy, so I was the primary communications radio man in my first platoon. So I had a lot of very lucky things happen. Then I worked in the training cell at SEAL Team 1, so I was teaching this stuff as a young enlisted guy. I was teaching all the tactics, and since I was single, guess what trip I went on? I went on every trip. I would go to land warfare. I'd go to CQC. I'd go to Mount. I'd go to the dive trips. I would participate in every trip, and I just got I was really lucky to have a lot of experience in that capacity as a young enlisted guy. Then I went to SEAL Team 2, was in a great platoon at SEAL Team 2. And again, we did those missions in the Persian Gulf, the VBSS missions in the Persian Gulf. So when a lot of SEALs were kind of sitting around not doing much, we were very lucky to be able to go and take down these smuggling ships over in the Persian Gulf. So I got some experience with that. And again, very lucky. All this is very lucky. And then, like I said, I went to college. By the time I was done with college, I was very lucky that I got sent to SEAL Team 7. I knew the officer detailer. I had worked for him before, and he sent me to a SEAL team that was getting ready to deploy. When I got there, the CO of the SEAL Team 7 that I went to, I had worked for him before. And he promptly fired one of the platoon commanders and put me in a platoon just a few months before going on deployment. And then I happened to be the one platoon that was in Iraq in 2003, and then other platoons started coming in. But we were lucky enough to do tons of operations, almost all direct action missions. Then got done. So I this whole time I'm very lucky because I'm paying attention. I'm learning a lot of tactics. I came in when there were still Vietnam guys. I had guys like Roger Hayden teaching me about cover and move, had the Vietnam era guys talking to me and explaining tactics to me. And I just got very lucky. And then by the time I got to Ramadi, I had been in for 15 years, and that's a real blessing when you have that much time in, and now I'm over there, and there's a very target rich environment. I had a couple awesome platoons with me, a bunch of great guys, and we were in a place that had a lot of bad guys that needed to die. And so we took the fight to the enemy. We had an incredible working relationship with the conventional forces that were there. First, it was the 228, a National Guard unit out of Pennsylvania, and then it was the 11 AD. For the 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division, who were just outstanding. All these soldiers and Marines were just outstanding individuals and human beings to work with, ultra professional. And really, in Ramadi, to answer your question, that was a long lead up to answer your question. the things that I had learned throughout my career that were for the most part theoretical because I had never really had the opportunity to test them. Now the theory was put to the test. The theory of cover move, the theory of keeping things simple, the theory of prioritize and execute, the theory of decentralized command. All those things were absolutely put to the test. And just as the Vietnam guys had told them to me, they worked. And so then it was a matter of when I got done with that deployment, to your question about how did that impact my thinking about leadership, without a doubt, I recognized that leadership was the most important thing on the battlefield. And that's not just, I'm not saying I was the most important. I'm not saying Leif or Seth Stone was the most important because they were the platoon commanders, or even that the platoon chiefs were the most important, but every level of leadership, from the brigade commander, the battalion commanders, the company first sergeants, everyone that you worked with that was a strong leader had a huge impact. And that's why when I came home from that deployment, and again, it was Admiral McGuire that was the admiral. He was still in charge of the SEAL teams at the time. And he said to me, hey, where do you want to go? And I said to him, I want to go take over the training for the West Coast SEALs. And the reason that I wanted to do that was because I knew that the lessons that I had learned, I had to pass them on. You know, we saw the fading of combat a little bit as we ended our deployment to Ramadi, but I still envisioned that there would be the next group of platoons and the next group of platoons going into Ramadi and or these surrounding urban combat areas and being engaged in sustained urban combat like we were. And I knew the importance of leadership, and I wanted to take those lessons and pass them on to young leaders like you to make sure that when you got your guys out, you could accomplish the mission, you could take care of your guys, and you could kill bad guys. And that's why I ended up going to TRADET, and that's where I really became focused on teaching leadership.
Yeah, and I ended up in Charlie Platoon for SEAL Team 3 in Task Unit Bruiser as well, in Ramadi, as it turns out. Now, it wasn't nearly as intense, but as your deployment, you guys got all the bad guys for us, but we were still busy. We were quite busy, and then you go to Afghanistan, and it's a totally different type of environment, where some of those lessons we learned in Ramadi just didn't apply. What I liked about, I think, the way the teams teaches leadership and teaches tactical leadership is we start with how to think. And I think that's important. It's not necessarily here's your doctrine, you better read it and memorize it. It's you need to learn how to think and how to problem solve and prioritize and then execute. And I remember you and Leif would teach this stuff. You would give us these scenarios and then challenge us to think through it. That helped enormously, I think, when we actually got to the teams, because we were now understanding how to think. That's what I got from it.
Well, certainly you're 100% right. And giving someone a cookie cutter solution to a problem that you cannot fathom. You cannot fathom the problems that someone is going to face in combat. You can give them something similar. You know that they're going to be under pressure. You know there's going to be emotions and screaming and people are going to be getting hurt. You know those things, but you can't fathom where the enemy is going to come from, where they're going to be located, what other issues, what problems are you going to have with your communications, who in your platoon is going to freeze up and not want to move, who in your platoon is going to stop listening and just go hyper aggressive. We can't fathom or pretend to know what that is going to look like for someone when they enter combat. But what we can do is put them in pressure situations where they do learn to take a step back, detach, assess what's happening, and then think through how to solve this problem. And that's absolutely what we focused on.
And so you moved on from there to TRADET, and TRADET's our training detachment. It's a command that is in charge of basically setting up all the logistics and training curriculum for the team so that the platoons don't have to figure that out on their own. Now, that's actually different than, say, how Special Forces do it, although I think they've adapted to that model. I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, and back in the 90s, we trained ourselves as well. So at a SEAL team, you had a training cell, and that's what I was a part of when I was a young enlisted guy. And it was cool, but just logistically speaking, it's way more efficient to have, we've got a bunch of SEAL teams. Let's buy a big, giant, beautiful range. Let's invest in beautiful targets. Let's get an incredible amount of ammunition. Let's hire role players that can work through all the different teams. So it's definitely a more efficient way, and it was able to standardize the good standard operating procedures that we had. We were able to standardize those and utilize them. And we were also able to identify things that really didn't work that well and able to take lessons learned from team to team and pass those on. So the Tradeette was a very efficient way of training the SEAL teams.
And what were some of the changes you made there?
As you mentioned, coming back from Ramadi, it was a tough deployment. We lost Mark Lee. We lost Mikey Mansour. We had Ryan Jobe severely wounded. Cowie Mayero was wounded badly. We had a bunch of other guys that were wounded. We're in a lot of really close combat with the enemy. And I realized that in those situations, like I said, the leadership was the most important thing. And again, not just the platoon commander, but the chief, the LPO, the E5s, understanding what the impact of their machine gun has and where they can best locate themselves. So really, I started to focus on putting the platoons, putting the task unit into very high pressure scenarios, and then allowing them to work their way out. And it is it's like, those little mind trick puzzles where you've got to put triangles together to form a square or something like this. And if you see it for the first time, it might take you 30 minutes to figure it out. The second time you see it, it'll take you 30 seconds. Well, there's that kind of progression you would see with these young leaders, where the first time you put them into a pressure situation, they freeze up, they make bad calls, they lose their temper, they have a bunch of responses that are all wrong. And then eventually you say, hey, look, all this craziness is going on. You need to take a step back. You need to take a breath. You need to look around, assess what's happening, and figure out what your next move is going to be. And yelling isn't going to help you do that. Screaming isn't going to help you do that. Running around, shooting your gun isn't going to help you do that. What you need to do is take a step back and figure out what's happening. And you could truly train, and we would watch these leaders get better at doing that. And quite frankly, it's the same thing. It's the same thing that happens now. We train, I have a company called Echelon Front. We train leaders at civilian companies. And we watch the same progression, how they interact with a client that is losing their temper, how they react, how they interact with one of their employees that doesn't understand why they're doing what they're doing and therefore isn't making their best effort, how they're going to deal with a problem that's coming down that they didn't foresee, an emergent opportunity that they're not ready for. And you can truly train people to behave correctly in those leadership situations. And all that started when I was at Tradeette. That's where I focused, was how can I help these leaders be ready to lead when bad things happen?
So maybe that gets us to some New Year's resolutions and staying on what you call the path. This is what you teach in Extreme Ownership, the Dichotomy of Leadership. I'm probably missing some. You've written a lot of books. But those are a couple. And then certainly it's what you teach at Echelon Front. I mean, fundamentally, it's staying on the path. I think that seems to center your messaging. So tell us, what is this path?
It's a path of discipline, really. I mean, look, I wrote another book called Discipline Equals Freedom. And that is something that I used to teach you guys when you were coming through. And it was kind of sort of a weird movement into, hey, think about how you are as a human being. And I would start off by saying, look, as you as a human being, the more discipline you have, the more freedom you're going to have. So if you're a young Navy guy and you want to have financial freedom one day, well, guess what? You better have financial discipline right now. That means save your money. Don't buy the Super Duty Ford F-350 truck when you come home from deployment, and don't buy the Harley Davidson that you don't actually need. Save that money, invest that money, buy a house. And if you have that kind of financial discipline, you'll end up with financial freedom, and same thing with time. Everyone wants more free time. Well, how do you get more free time? Have more disciplined time management. So I would start off by explaining to the individuals, the young leaders, hey, if you want to have more freedom in your life, if you want to have more freedom in the teams as an individual, if you have the discipline to do what you're supposed to do and do it well, no one's ever going to have to tell you what to do. I mean, when I joined the Navy, my dad said, you're going to hate it because you don't like authority and you don't like people telling you what to do. And he was right. I don't like authority. I don't like people telling me what to do, especially when I was 18 years old. So when I was in my first platoon, if I didn't want my platoon chief to tell me what to do, or I didn't want my platoon commander to tell me what to do, I would do it. I would anticipate what needed to be done, and I would do it. That way, when my chief would come over and say, "Hey, Jocko, you need to get this done," I'd say, "Oh, it's already done, chief. We already got it." That kind of discipline ended up with me with all kinds of freedom in the SEAL teams. I mean, a crazy amount of freedom to do what I wanted to do in the SEAL teams. And it's the same thing with your platoon. If you have a disciplined platoon with disciplined standard operating procedures, that platoon can do things very quickly. You have all kinds of ability to and freedom to maneuver that element very rapidly, because if you're one of my platoons and I look at you and say, "Dan, go take down that building over there," a building we hadn't planned to take down, you would just say, "Cool, got it, Jocko." And you would go to that building and you take it down. You didn't need to tell me what people you were going to take, or what weapons you were going to use, or how you were going to enter the building, or what you were going to do with any terrorists you found, or you didn't need to tell me any of that, because we already knew, because we had standard operating procedures. So because we have discipline, it gives us freedom. So that's a message that I try to get across to people. And I would say that the path is the path of discipline. And if you have discipline in your life, then it's going to help you. And to get onto your New Year's resolution question, I normally don't do much of a New Year's resolution, because I'm kind of doing it all the time. I used to joke with my wife. My wife used to ask me, "Well, what's your New Year's resolution going to be?" And I'd say, "Oh, surf more and get better at jiu-jitsu," which is what I was always trying to do anyway, surf more and get better at jiu-jitsu. So this year I talked about, I think the one approach you can take to the new year is thinking about things from a strategic perspective instead of a tactical perspective. And what that means for the civilians out there, thinking of things from a long-term perspective instead of a short-term perspective. So when you eat that donut, that's short-term, going to taste good. It's going to give you a little sugar rush, but long-term, it's a disaster. Short-term, skipping the workout, staying in bed, it might feel good right now. Long-term, it's a disaster. Buying, something that you can't really afford, but you want it, so you put it on credit. Short-term might feel good. Long-term, it's a disaster. So thinking about things from a strategic perspective, if you do that, and it applies to everything, not just your personal life, not just your fitness, not just your finances, but to everything. If you're interacting with your boss, how are you interacting with your boss? How are you interacting with your subordinates? If you're barking orders at your subordinates, sure, you can get them to do something right now because they're scared that you're going to fire them. And it might be a little tactical win that you got them to do what you wanted them to do. But where does that leave you in a long term? Long term, you have people that don't want to work for you. Long term, you have people that are leaving your team, leaving your organization. So for this year, kind of the word that I put out was think of things from a strategic perspective. Think of things from a long-term perspective instead of a short-term perspective.
And I would say build good habits, right? And one of the questions I have is, how do you even know what a good habit is? So, maybe for example, you say get up earlier, but how much earlier? Like what's right for you? And then how do you figure out what's right for you to be doing, and what is a waste of time and what is not a waste of time? Does that just require trial and error? Does that require simply good judgment on the individual's part? Because I don't think you and I can tell somebody what a proper good habit is, what's exactly right for them. And I always wonder, how should I tell someone to think through that question?
Yeah, well, for one thing, I think you need to look at things through a long-term perspective. So when you look up and say, okay, I'm going to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm going to get 3 hours of sleep every night, take a look at that. You'll get a lot done for 3 days, maybe 2 days, maybe 4 days, and then you're going to kind of be a disaster after that. So you got to, and if you say, well, sleep is the most important thing, so I'm going to sleep 10 hours a day, and now you're missing out on some things that you should be doing. So again, I think just looking at things from a strategic perspective. And then the other thing is being humble enough to say, you know what, this isn't working. This plan I came up with is not good. And this is you mentioned military leadership earlier. This is a problem that many people in the military have, which, and not just the military, but in the civilian world as well. I come up with a plan and we start to execute my plan. And as the plan starts to go sideways, instead of me saying, you know what, I was wrong about this, we need to make these adjustments. Instead, I just keep trying to do the same thing and burn into the ground. So I think figuring out what's right. You have to look at things with a long-term perspective. You also have to do something that basically what I just described, which is iterative decision making, right? You don't need to make these giant adjustments all at once because you might be going too far. 3 o'clock in the morning might be too little sleep. But if you say, hey, I normally get up at 6, I'm going to see what 5:45 feels like. I'm going to see what 5:30 feels like. Oh, I actually feel good. I'm going to try 5. Oh, 5, I feel tired all day. Cool. Now I figured out what to do. So making iterative decision and then making adjustments based on the feedback loop that you get is how you can come to a conclusion that, yeah, this is a pretty good path that I'm on.
So I want to ask you about energy levels because, this is something I've dealt with a lot, getting into this new world of politics where it's quite different. It's impossible for me to build a routine, traveling everywhere all the time. There is no set schedule on anything that I really do. And so it took me a while. It took about a year, I think, to come up with a better, I wouldn't even call it a routine because I still don't have a routine, but at least a better way to hold my energy throughout the day. And, combination of diet and supplements and just figuring what that right balance is. It's hard to explain to somebody exactly what that is, but what you're a guy who's pretty hyper productive. And, so you could be up, like you said, you could be up at 4 a.m., but if you're just tired the whole time and you're not thinking clearly, you're not producing anything. So there's really no point in you just being awake, but you're being productive. And so there's obviously something you're doing with your energy, to maintain your cognitive abilities and your consciousness and your body to higher energy levels. Do you have any suggestions for people?
Definitely. You mentioned diet. Diet is good. And if you have a good, clean diet, you're going to feel better. When I eat trash, I don't feel like I have a lot of energy. When I'm eating, if I go out and with my family and we go get a pizza or something, I can guarantee the next day is not going to be an optimal day. Now, hey, is it okay to do that sometimes? Absolutely. It's like go out and have pizza is amazing. It tastes amazing. I don't say never eat a pizza, but I always know that, hey, I ate a pizza yesterday. I'm probably going to feel like crap today. If I eat another bad meal, it just kind of spirals. So eating clean is very important. When I go to sleep, I'm tired. So I go to sleep, my head hits the pillow, and generally I wake up, 6 hours later, and I feel really good. And people tell me there's like a genetic component to it. And I believe that there is a genetic component that I don't need much sleep. The reason I think that is because I have kids, and my oldest daughter, when I would go to bed, when she was still in high school, and I'd go to bed at 11 o'clock at night, she'd be awake studying. And then when I'd wake up at 4:30, she'd be awake studying. And she just doesn't need much sleep. My next daughter, my middle daughter, she gets out of bed when you pull her out of bed. Like she is going to sleep. And that's kind of like my wife. My wife will sleeps a lot more than I do. My son's kind of a short sleeper as well. And my youngest daughter, she'll sleep until the same thing, until there's some kind of an emergency happening. So I think some of it is genetic. But regardless of your genetics, if your genetics tell you need 8 hours, figure out how to work it. It's important, and figure out how to get that 8 hours, and make sure that you're not spending 2 hours before you go to bed looking at, your phone or whatever, reading through the gossip columns of the various news channels that are out there right now, which are basically now gossip columns in many respects. So yeah, I think eating clean is really smart, and get good quality sleep.
And Jocko energy drinks.
I mean, and this does come in handy. Yeah.
I would say
I made these because my first deployment to Iraq, we were doing very long vehicle patrols. In my seat, my seat in my Humvee, I had like frag grenade, crash grenade, and then energy drink. And sometimes I would need to drink one. And then when you drink one, you'd feel good for 2 hours or an hour and a half or 2 hours, and then you'd get this crash and you'd feel horrible and the jitters and all that. And it really made me not want to drink energy drinks. And then I saw so many guys in the teams that were full on addicted to energy drinks, and they're absolutely horrible for you, filled with sugar, filled with chemicals. And yet I realized that what they wanted from them. Sometimes you do got to pull an all-nighter. Sometimes you are out sitting on a target, or you're patrolling to a target or whatever, and you need some energy. And so eventually, I have a supplement company. It was like, can we actually do this? Can we make something that is truly good for you and yet gives you energy? And we did it. It's sweetened with monk fruit. We pasteurize it. So every energy drink that you get has got chemicals added to it so that it's preserved when it's on the shelf. Mm-hmm. And we went to the next level. It took us all kinds of effort to get this done, to make the drinks pasteurized. So there's no chemicals in them.
Really?
Look at the ingredients. Sometimes it's just a very short list. They got only 95 milligrams of caffeine, which is like a cup of coffee. So it's not one of these energy drinks that has 300 milligrams and it makes you freak out. But yes, when I'm feeling like I need a little bit of extra energy, I'll crack open one of my drinks, and there's no crash from it. It's good to go.
There's a lot of this organic stuff that's coming out that I like. I mean, I like mushroom powder. That's hot and heavy. Whatever Joe Rogan recommends, the Alpha Brain stuff, I actually do think that works, and it doesn't give you this jittery feeling. I also just don't eat that much during the day. That's one thing I just stopped doing, because I'm like, I'm not that hungry. I don't need it. I could snack a little bit. If I have a big lunch, and I have to have big lunches sometimes because it's like a political event or something, right, and I'm just done after that. If I have to give a speech, I will not, and it's always a dinner and then a speech, and they're like, "Oh, we'll get you dinner." I'm like, I don't want it. Just box it up, because I cannot eat and then go on stage. Like, my brain doesn't work.
Yep, I'm the exact same way. And you're right. That's another huge energy killer, is a giant meal, whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner. You have a big giant meal that sits in your gut, filled with carbs. It'll knock you out. And I'm the same way. I mean, I speak, and when I speak, I don't eat. If I'm speaking at 7:00 at night, I'm not eating until 9.
Yeah. No, okay. Well, we're on the same page there. You know what's funny though is, in the teams, I was always like, I have to have 3 steaks a day, because I got to get huge, right? I gotta, because we would read that we needed to eat the same grams of protein as our weight or something. And then eventually I just stopped doing that. And I'm like, and my lifting hasn't really changed. I mean, I'm not I don't hit the same numbers that I was hitting, when I was 30, but it's not that different, and I'm not losing weight the way I was afraid I was going to lose weight. So I'm like, I don't know if this is an age thing, or if I just never needed to do what I was doing. I have no idea.
Yeah, well, at least you were in. When I first got in, man, our diets were atrocious. We had no idea what we were doing, and so the diet was a disaster. And then, as we were very lucky to be on the cutting edge of nutrition science. Mm-hmm. We started hearing about keto before anybody knew about keto. We knew about keto, and so I think we got some huge benefits from being in the teams during that time. All
right, let's move on from workout routines and diet, and maybe a more serious conversation that I wanted to get your take on. You had a pretty viral video go out when Afghanistan had fallen. That we had people abandoned there. I think we had just sent in the 5,000 troops to retake Kabul in this utter disaster of a withdrawal. And you had a viral video. You're like, this is what I would say as president of the United States. And it basically could be summed up as, you're going to get in there and fix your mistakes. You're going to admit that you made a mistake, and you're going to get in there and fix them and make sure our people are out, and then end it. Decisive action. Now that is not exactly what happened. But I don't know how much time we want to spend talking about those days. Maybe the broader failure in leadership. The endless wars, as they call. I don't like that term, because I think it forces people into this position of, if you're doing anything, you're at war, and it's an endless war. And so the only options are do nothing or do everything. And I'm like, guys, that's not what foreign policy is. There's a lot in between. We don't need to be nation building, doing endless wars. I get that. But there's a lot in between. And So that's why I don't use that term. But what were our leadership failures? What's your general take that you want to jump in on here?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of reading through in a couple of years when some books come out with some behind the scenes of what was actually happening and who was pushing what agenda and why they were pushing it. You mentioned that the forever wars, and these aren't forever wars necessarily, and a presence in various places around the world is preventative of war. It stops war from happening. And that clearly, that idea has sort of been lost. And so we need to pay attention to that. Giving up a strategic air bases in critical parts of the world where you have a presence has a huge impact in the way that people behave in those areas. And it's actually in a positive way. So yeah, that was definitely a disturbing thing to watch unfold. And what I mentioned earlier about people coming up with a plan and then sticking to their plan regardless of how it looks, it is sort of what happened in Afghanistan. You could see we gave up air bases that we shouldn't have given up. We started collapsing into zones that we shouldn't have collapsed into. It was just, and instead of saying, hey, you know what, this isn't working the way we expected it to work. The Taliban is sweeping through the entire country this rapidly. We didn't expect that. We're going to stop it. Or, instead of saying, hey, this is the mistakes that we made, we're making some assessments, we're going to make some adjustments, we're going to do it differently. No one did that. And we just kind of fell apart and left in a terrible way. And not to mention, we lost 13 service members in that whole debacle. Yeah. So just horrible to watch. Horrible to watch, sickening to watch. And you mentioned that video that I made, and that was after things were already going bad. And what triggered me to make that video, because I'm watching it, and I don't do a ton of political commentary because a lot of it is things are happening so rapidly, and there's so many people commenting that I just don't spend a bunch of time commenting. And I generally watch things, and I like to process and take a little bit more of a strategic long-term view before trying to make a statement about something, including that, but as it was happening, there's two things that triggered me. The first one was seeing the Taliban soldiers with the American weaponry raising their Taliban flag in sort of a mockery of Iwo Jima. And so I saw that picture. I really felt horrible. I felt angry, and I knew that I was emotional about it. And I just said, okay, they're playing these games. They're trying to make us emotional. It's working. So I'm not going to say anything. But then when I saw these pictures that the Taliban and videos of the Taliban with thousands and thousands of American weapons, night vision, aircraft, armored vehicles. And I thought to myself, you and me, we went over and fought against these fundamentalists, these jihadis in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were using rusty AK-47s. They were using, crappy vests that they had left over from the Soviet Union. They were using old junky, RPGs, and it was still hard. And now I'm thinking about the next generation of military that's going to go out and fight against an enemy that has equivalent, the identical night vision, the identical lasers, the identical body armor that we have. And it just infuriated me and really just not really infuriated. It sickened me. It sickened me to see that. And I couldn't believe that the Biden administration at the time was talking about how this was a great operation. I forget the words that he used, but this was a great operation. And it was just sickening. And so I decided to apply, the first book that I wrote, the title is Extreme Ownership. There's a reason that we use that title, Extreme Ownership. When you make a mistake, you take ownership of the mistake and then you get it fixed. You don't sit there and pretend that it didn't happen. You don't blame someone else. You not only do you not blame the Taliban, what do you say? Oh, it's the Taliban's fault. That's what the Taliban does, or the previous administration. It's their fault because they set this up. You're the one that's in the seat. You're the one that's in the seat. When you're in charge of something, you take ownership. You solve the problem, and it didn't happen. It was disgusting.
No, it didn't. It still hasn't really happened, and I think we're going to hear a lot more out of that region. Because like you said, they're that well equipped, they're well funded, they have all the time and space. They know that guys like you and me are not following them anymore. They know that. These over the horizon operations, this is a non-existent capability that we talk about. I mean, it's not real in any sense. I mean, and I look at people on my side, on the conservative side. Now there are some legitimate critiques, when it comes to say leadership over the last 20 years. And people say, like, these generals just sort of institutionalized this war, kind of did the same thing over and over again, just did whatever politically correct thing was necessary to get their next star. They didn't really care if they were, quote unquote, winning the war. And I think that's a pretty valid criticism. I think it's a little hyped up too much, because I think in the end it was politicians' fault, not necessarily military leaders. But to what extent is it military leaders' job to say, full stop, we need a strategy that has some kind of end goal? Or at least we need to be honest with people and say, look, we are here in preventative measures. We're not here to win necessarily. And if we are, we need to define what winning actually looks like. But nobody ever really did that. Is that a lack of leadership?
Yeah, there's the similarities to Vietnam are incredible. And the fact that these lessons weren't learned, and me included, I should have been more vocal about what's happening and why it's happening. The way the military is set up now with rotations, which is something they started in Korea. Towards the end of Korea, they started doing rotations, and then eventually, replacing people. You only did a year. That was the same thing in Vietnam. You did a year. When you were done with your year, you went home. And so when World War II happened, you deployed until we won. Guys went on 3-year deployments, 4-year deployments, where they never saw their family. And what that gave you was this incredible continuity, where people understood, and the senior leadership understood what it was going to take to move forward. And they couldn't just say, well, I'm going to kind of hold the line right now, and then I'll get to go home with a Bronze Star and a promotion. No, it was like, oh, you're going to stay here. You fight until you win. And what that means is, before you enter a war, you make the decision that this is what we're willing to do to win. We're willing to deploy our young men and women into this combat zone until we win, until we reach a point where this is what we came to achieve. So, yeah, we really need to take a hard look at that. I mean, it was the same thing in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese army was very corrupt. Were there some good soldiers there? Absolutely. There were some incredible soldiers from South Vietnam. Some of the folks that work with special operations were incredibly brave soldiers. But there was also a lot of corruption in the senior leadership. And when the senior leadership fell apart, South Vietnam fell apart. Same thing in Afghanistan. When the senior leadership started to leave, when the president fled the country, it's a total disaster. And to your point about knowing what's happening on the ground, you use the term, we're not following them anymore. And just to make sure people understand what you mean by following the Taliban. Doesn't mean we're following them on social media. It means we're listening to what we're saying. It means we have human intelligence sources on the ground that we interact with on a regular basis, so we understand what the enemy is thinking and we can contain their aggression. But to completely leave them to their own device and allow them to do freedom of maneuver, to do whatever they want, is going to end up having a massively negative impact on us at some time in the future.
Yeah, there's this.
Not to mention, look, the Taliban, sure, are they a percentage of the population? Yes, they absolutely are. But the vast majority of the people that live in Afghanistan do not want Taliban rule. Are they submitting to it now? Yes, they are, because it's that or die. But the young girls that have been ripped out of school are being sold into sex slavery. That's what's happening right now. And that is not the majority of the population. The Taliban is not the majority of the population.
It seems to me that the people who were very emotional and almost emotionally obsessed with ending the war, getting every troop out, as if we don't have tens of thousands of troops all over the world, doing strategic missions. And those strategic missions can be pretty boring, right? They're often just doing training missions with allies. I mean, look, a good way to prevent war is to make sure everybody's your ally, which is why we have a presence everywhere. These are very basic things that have never been explained to a lot of the American people. And I think over time, people got very emotional about this. And I think it led to some of these decisions. This idea that if we just ignore stuff, if we just stick our head in the sand, everything will be fine. What you forget is that you become quite an easy target when your head's in the sand, when you're not looking around. And you forget that it's a 12-hour flight to the Middle East. This is not a large universe that we live in. It's a small world, and it's intricate, whether you like it or not. I wish it wasn't. And what people had to answer, too, is this question. You can argue whether the initial decision to go to Iraq is a good one or not, okay? And in hindsight, a lot of people would argue it wasn't. But the question is, we did it, okay? So we're already in a situation where we did it. And now the question is, now what? And the same question for Afghanistan. Now, everybody thought we should go into Afghanistan. That was actually not very controversial. But then the question becomes, what do you do on day 2, on day 3, on day 4? And to say that it's an easy discussion is crazy, because it's a hard one. Do you leave? Do you cut your losses and leave? Or do you try to build up a partner force capacity and an ally that you can rely on so that you never have to go back? And this is not a conversation we've really dealt with.
Well, back to my point earlier about something as silly as New Year's resolutions, what you have to do in these situations, and what we fail to do as a nation, is we don't look at things from a strategic perspective. Sure, and Afghanistan is one point. What strategically, where does that put us with the Middle East in 5 years, in 7 years, in 10 years? Oh, it might be a tactical win that we got all of our Americans out, or at least we got a bunch of them out, or at least allegedly the war is over. But that's a tactical victory. Where does it leave us in 5 years, in 7 years, in 10 years? And not to mention, when you've got folks like the Chinese and the Russians who only think strategic. They're thinking about where we're going to be in 25 years, how they're going to defeat us in 25 years or 30 years or 20 years. That's what they're thinking about, and we're thinking about the next election cycle. So we lack the continuity, and we lack the strategic continuity in this country for people to understand where we're heading. And to your point earlier, building relationships with people, building relationships with other countries is the way that you extend peace, and you have peace in the world is by building relationships. Let me tell you, you don't build relationships when you don't interact with people. You don't. So if you want to build a relationship with your neighbor, you don't put a big fence in between you and never talk to them. No, you bring them over a casserole and you say, hey, if you want to come over for dinner in a couple nights, let me know. I'm making hot dogs. And they come over and you eat and you share ideas, and maybe there's some things you disagree on, but maybe you both agree that, hey, wouldn't it be good to redo the fence? Let's put some money together and we'll redo the fence in between our properties. Okay, that sounds great. It'll look better. So you cooperate. You give them something. They give you something. But to just build a barbed wire fence and not talk to them, you're not going to build relationships. And the world is small. Everyone's our neighbor now. Like you said, it's a 12-hour flight. So we're not thinking strategic and building relationships with people and building relationships with other nation states the way we should be. And in fact, what we've done in this case is we've lost the trust of an entire group of people, an entire nation, and really much of the world now looking at us going, oh, wait a second. If you ever come to help us, you probably won't see it through.
Another criticism I have of the current military, a lot of people have this criticism, and I guess I want to ask you, am I overblowing it? But it's the sort of woke cultural trend that I see in some parts of the military. And I don't think it's top down. I don't think it's being institutionalized, but I do think it's sort of organically spread in certain commands, especially the Air Force. I mean, I say that half jokingly, but a lot of the whistleblower complaints we have just happen to be from the Air Force. Today, we were getting hit up by a million Air Force NCOs to share this story because somebody basically leaked a story about how in Air Force Special Operations, a female recruit had been pushed through training, after she quit multiple times. And it gets to a larger question. What should females' role be in combat, in special operations? That's one question, but which is debatable. People debate that. The second question, though, of should you change standards, really shouldn't be up for debate. And there's this effort where there's an incentive structure in place for senior leaders to do what is, for lack of a better term, politically correct in order to move up. And that's unfortunate that that's what moves them up as opposed to making their force more deadly. And how we change that, I'm not sure. I've joked with you before that if I ever became Secretary of Defense, I would ask you to be Undersecretary of Culture and just go through and just change this somehow. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that generally?
So the military, the purpose of the military is to win wars, to fight and win wars. And that's what the focus should be. Now, are there things that you look at and you say, oh, adding this group of people or bringing more of this type of person will in fact help us win wars? Is that possible? Yes, it's absolutely possible. I know we worked with females in Iraq that would go out and interact with the local females because the local females generally would not want to talk to males. So we had females that would come out and interact with the local populace. And what did that mean? That mean they were taking risk. That means that they were patrolling down streets with every other infantry unit that was out there. And they had a very specific job, and it was a job that as females, they were the only ones that could do that job. And there's other examples of that. So if you have a situation where it's beneficial to bring a certain type of person into the military because it enhances your warfighting capability, great. If you're bringing a certain type of person into the military for any other reason, it's going to be problematic to understand why we're doing this, why we're focusing on that, why we're spending money on things that aren't enhancing our warfighting capability. So, and warfighting capability, don't get me wrong, that's a broad term. There are a lot of civil affairs. When we talk about civil affairs, that's a warfighting capability. That's a line of operations that you absolutely have to execute in a counterinsurgency. And you need, for instance, females to help with that effort. And there are incredibly brave females that go out there and went out there and did that job. And again, that's one example. But if we're doing something where it doesn't enhance this broad spectrum of warfighting capability, then the military should be saying, actually, no, we don't think that enhances this capability, the warfighting capability for us, and therefore we are not going to do it.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And in special operations, people don't realize, females play a pretty large role and have for a long time, well before we were having this debate about whether women should be allowed to go to BUDS, for instance, well before that. Like you said, female engagement teams. There's also a very important intelligence gathering role where a female is just better suited at certain times. Maybe because there's a lot of reasons that could be. Because of rapport being built with somebody, just because of appearances. So that role has been there for a long time. But that's a different question than say putting on a trident and being an assaulter. It is a very different question, and it's a tough one. It's a settled question at this point. I don't think we're going back. Anybody can apply. But what also should be settled is that we keep the standards that we have for these training programs, and that's something that I think has rightfully freaked a lot of people out, which is why that story came out today.
I just did a podcast about Project 100,000, which is something that McNamara rammed down the throat of the military during the Vietnam War, where they started taking low IQ soldiers and Marines and recruits, and they were a complete disaster. It was a complete disaster, and it all had to do with exactly what you're saying. When you lower the standards, people are going to pay. The people on the ground are the ones that are going to pay. There's no bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. that's going to be hoping that some other soldier is strong enough to carry them out if they get shot. That's not happening. So these things have been tried before in the past, and lowering the standards is an absolutely terrible idea. And I hope and pray and will do whatever I can to make sure that that doesn't come to fruition. It's a disaster.
No. All right. Can I hit you with a few questions from the audience? All right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Number one, who would win in an arm wrestle? Dan versus Jocko? That's a dumb question. Obviously, I would win. Okay, this one actually came up the most. Was a ticket of you and I running. So, but would you ever run for office, political office?
I really hope not. I really don't want to be in the political arena. I don't like politics. I don't
either. All right.
Yeah.
but you got
I don't like politics. I don't like the life that you're leading, right? I don't like the fact that you don't have any kind of schedule, the fact that you're having to, travel all over the place and meet with people you might not want to meet with. So I hope that I can avoid ever being in the political arena. I think the only thing that would cause me to do that is if things got really, really, really bad. And people say, during 2020, people were saying, is it bad enough yet? And of course, I said, no, you're asking me on a cell phone over social media, over a Wi-Fi network that's up and running while you're sipping a glass of water and you have power in your house. If things got really, really bad, maybe I would enter some kind of political arena, or at least take over as some sort of benevolent dictator. But until things get bad enough, I hope to never have to do politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's toxic. It's toxic as hell. And I mean, another question that came up a lot was, how do your principles? I mean, people read your books, they listen to your podcast. I don't want to call you a life coach, but kind of, right? I don't know if you'd ever describe yourself that way, but you are coaching people in how to be and how to behave and how to build good habits, how to lead, how to be a good follower. And a lot of people asked, how do you? Because you don't talk about politics a lot. But what are the attributes that you see lacking in political leadership and the politicians that you see on social media, on the news, and you think to yourself, God, if you only read this lesson, maybe you would be better?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the first one is the idea of taking ownership when things go wrong. And we just never see that. We just never see a leader stepping up and saying, hey, this is my mistake. This is what we're going to do to fix it. Instead, it's blame all the time. It's blame the other side. They just blame, and that causes inaction, right? Because if I think it's Dan's fault, well, then I don't have to change anything. Mm-hmm. But if I say, hey, this is my fault, and here's some adjustments that I'm going to make sure we do a better job, and all the principles apply. I mean, cover and move. That's teamwork. That's working together, keeping things simple, right? Prioritize and execute. What are the priorities that the country should have? And then let's execute on those ones that are going to have the biggest impact. Decentralized command. Do people in New York City have a really even remotely close lifestyle to someone that lives in rural Nebraska? So that's why we have decentralized command, so that decentralized government leadership inside of states and cities and towns and counties can make decisions that are best for the areas that they actually live in. And as soon as you do centralized command and you start putting mandates on people that are universal mandates, they don't apply the same way in different areas. So that's why the laws of combat leadership that I taught you in whatever it was, 2000 and whatever, these apply equally to any leadership position in business and in politics.
One of the I'm asked a lot, are more veterans going to run? Why should veterans run? And I didn't actually always know how to answer that question, right? Because it's sort of a throwaway answer to that would be, well, they know what real service is, okay? But what does that mean to people? I'm not actually sure. I think an answer that I've come up with, which I've come to believe is absolutely true, is generally speaking, not all the time, but generally speaking, the veterans I see run for Congress, they want to be right. What do I mean by that? They want to be correct. When they say something, they want it to be correct. Now, that sounds very simple, But in politics, you'd have no idea how often people, instead of wanting to be correct, they would rather be popular. And so they're going to listen to consultants. They're going to listen to people and say, look, you should say this. You should spin it this way. You shouldn't go down this path because it'll make people upset. And a veteran thinks to himself, well, then why don't I just explain it to them? Why don't I just actually tell them the truth? Because it's easy to tell people what they want to hear. You know, people talk about populism all the time, but how the hell do you define populism? And I define it as basically just telling people what they want to hear. You feel something? Okay, let me confirm that for you. Let me affirm what you're feeling, your emotions, your beliefs, instead of leading somebody to the truth, which is harder. It's a hell of a lot harder.
So, first of all, when you say that people want to be right, I don't like the way that sounds, but then you morphed it into something that I do like. So, look, if you and I are having a discussion and my goal is to be right, I don't like that. And I don't want to have that attitude. What I want to do is I want to figure out what the truth is. And so if I'm just looking to be right and you give me a counter argument that makes sense, well, I might just throw some other counter argument so I can prove them right. That's what a lot of politicians do. What I like where you ended up was telling the truth. Hey, this is the truth about what's happening. And part of the truth of what's happening is I'm not 100% sure. Part of the truth of what's happening is, hey, this is the events that are unfolding. Here's what I think we should do. I might be wrong and might have to make adjustments. And if I do, I will tell you that I'm wrong and we got to make some adjustments. And instead, people just stick with whatever idea they came out with. And we've seen this countless times now in the past few years, especially when you wrap it around some of the things that happened in Afghanistan, when you wrap it around the things that have happened with COVID. It's just, hey, I'm going to stick to my guns about what I said a month ago or 2 months ago. Whereas, look, if I'm your platoon commander and I say, hey, we're going to do this operation tonight, and I come in later and say, hey, look, we just got some new intel. It doesn't look like this is going to be a good operation. We're not going to do it. You don't go, oh, see, Jocko doesn't know what he's talking about. You can say, okay, he's analyzing the intelligence and things have changed. And that's what American people want to hear. They want to hear someone own it. Oh, this is what we thought was going to happen with this COVID. Okay. We were wrong a little bit. And here's some adjustments that we're going to make. And now it looks like we need to do this. And people go, okay, we got it. No one knew. We understand that. You don't know everything just because you're in a leadership position, and everyone understands that. So what we fail to do is we fail to discuss things. And if I'm so concerned about being right, then I don't actually listen to what you say. And I think that's a huge thing that leaders and politicians make the mistake of, is listening to what other people have to say. And if you come to me with an idea, my approach to your idea is, how can I support your idea? If we're doing an operation and you say, hey, Jocko, here's this target we're supposed to hit. I want to hit it from the west. And I was thinking to myself, I'm going to hit it from the east. No, you know what I'm going to say? Okay, let's see how I can support Dan. Does Dan want to get guys killed? No. Does he want to conduct a bad operation? No. He wants to hit that target and do a good job. So that's why he's coming to me with this plan. So I'm going to listen to him and try and provide support to your plan. And that's okay. People get so wrapped around their own plan and their own ideas, they don't listen to anybody else, and they end up just in an echo chamber. And that is not how you get to the truth. That's not how you get, not even necessarily to the truth, but you don't even get to the best idea in a situation, which is an awful outcome.
Well, it's an utter lack of humility. You know, if there's one attribute missing in political leadership often that I see, it's a lack of humility. People refuse to acknowledge that they might not know a lot of stuff, but boy, are they confident in those opinions. I mean, I've written about this so many times. I'm like, hey, look, if you don't know something, if you're ignorant about this issue, that's not your fault. I mean, you got other things to worry about. But if you're highly opinionated about it and not willing to change your mind, that's a problem. And it leads us down some very silly paths. And because veterans tend to think in the way that we've just been discussing for the last 2 minutes, more analytical, a little bit more problem solving. Again, a desire to get some sort of truth, because it's easy to say, oh, Dan wants to come from the West because he wants to get guys killed, right? To question somebody's intentions, which is what happens in politics all the time. It's a very dirty little trick. Oh, you only believe this because you're a communist or a rhino, and you're like, shut up. Just shut up. I mean, I say often, like, if you start out every sentence, and I'm talking to my own side here, with that's just establishment neocon rhino, like, it just shows that you have very little depth and that you don't know how to make an argument. And shouldn't your goal be to be correct and to make an airtight argument?
Yeah, and again, in the world and in combat and in business, there's not airtight arguments. There's not anyone that knows the future. The amount of times that I said, hey, this is 100% the way we should conduct this operation. This is 100% what the enemy is going to do. That doesn't happen. And so you can come up with an idea with the best intentions, and it can be a 90% solution. And when you figure out that that 10% thing that you didn't expect happens, and you say, hey, you know what? I didn't expect this. Here's an adjustment we need to make. I'm sorry I miscalculated. Let's move forward. People don't get mad at you. They go, oh, okay, well, at least he's humble enough to admit when he's wrong, and now we can move forward. Now, look, if you're an idiot and you make wrong decisions all the time, then eventually people say, hey, we're not going to follow you anymore. You keep making bad decisions. But that's not going to happen, right? Oh, if that happens, cool. You're not going to be a leader. But if you make good decisions 80% of the time, 90% of the time, 70% of the time, and occasionally you say, hey, I called this one wrong, let's make an adjustment. People say, okay, great. So, yeah, I mean, that's the second chapter of the book, Extreme Ownership, is check your ego. Humility is the most important quality for a leader to have, and really it's the most important quality for a human being to have.
All right, a couple more questions, and I will let you go. Thanks for spending so much time on this, Jocko. People are going to love this. Who are your role models? Do you have any that are alive? Or dead?
I mean, my biggest mentor and my biggest role model, oddly enough, is a guy that I never met, and he's not alive. Colonel David Hackworth, who he wrote the book About Face. I ended up writing the foreword to the reissue of that book. And it's a book that's 800 pages long. It's a book about combat and war. And it's a book, for me, it was a book about leadership. And I stole all kinds of things from Colonel David Hackworth. You started off the podcast by saying they called your task unit Bruiser. And that's inaccurate. I called the task unit Bruiser, which is a complete ripoff of what David Hackworth did when he got to Vietnam. When he was he changed his Fox company in Korea to Fighter Company. He changed the battalion he was in Vietnam to the hardcore. And I just ripped off what he did. So
I didn't know that. I didn't know that was the history of it. I love that.
Yeah, and so it's Task Unit Alpha, Task Unit Bravo, and Task Unit Charlie. And as soon as I took over the task unit, I had a meeting and I said, hey, we're not Task Unit Bravo anymore. We're Task Unit Bruiser. And that's it. That's what happened. And you could see guys, you see the look on their faces. You see them sit up in their chairs a little bit. Oh, we're Task Unit Bruiser. This is different. And that's something I just completely ripped off from Hackworth. And so Hackworth had a massive amount of influence on me. And then in another book I wrote called Leadership, Strategy, and Tactics, I talk about one of my platoon commanders who was a prior enlisted SEAL and just a legendary SEAL. And he took over a platoon where my platoon commander had been fired. He had been fired because he was arrogant and he had a big ego. And a guy named Brian Siebenauer, who we got permission to use his name when Admiral McRaven came on my podcast. And so Brian Siebenauer, who is my platoon commander in my second platoon, had an incredible impact on me. And I still try and emulate his attitude and his humility to this day.
It sort of kind of answered one of the questions, but your reading list, your recommended books for 2022. Give us top 3 that people should read.
Yeah. Go to my website, jockopodcast.com, and there's a tab on there called Books on the Podcast. I read all the time, and if they're good books, they make it on the podcast, and they're actually kind of in order of how I would read them. So the first podcast I didn't cover a book. The second podcast was About Face by David Hackworth, and it goes on from there. And it's like almost in order of how I would read these books.
Another question from the audience here. What would you recommend in growing my business for the year 2022? How have you done it?
So I've got a bunch of businesses, yeah. And one of the things that I recommend with businesses, and this is something that I've done all the time with all my businesses, it's something I talked about with the iterative decision-making process of, hey, make small steps. And so I've always done that with my businesses. Start off small, and then as you see a demand signal, grow the business. Don't overinvest. Don't spend a bunch of money when you're not 100% sure how well something is going to do or if there's really a demand for it. So, for instance, my supplement company, we started off just making one product. And once that product did well, we started making another product. When that product did well, and by the way, when we started making our first product, we didn't order, 200,000 units. We ordered 20,000 units. Saw how it did. Oh yeah, people want this product. Cool. Now we'll order 200,000. And then we were able to go into that business. Same thing with, we make apparel at Origin USA. And right now we have 5 properties. We have 3 factories, right? 3 factories right now. And we have 300 employees, 300 American employees, by the way, made in America, all of it. But we didn't start by saying, okay, let's go out and raise enough capital to buy 5 properties and the equipment inside of factories so we can manufacture jeans and boots and jujitsu gis and rash guards. We didn't do that. What did we do? We started with one factory. We started, and it all started with one sewing machine. That's where it started. And then as the demand signal grows, we grow. So, and you have to invest, and that's where we're at now. We got an incredible factory down in North Carolina. We got a couple factories up in the great state of Maine, and a bunch of employees there. And for me, and when you talk about growing your business, why are you growing your business? What are you trying to make happen? Yeah, you want a demand signal, but then also think about why you're trying to do it and what are your goals. And for me, one of the premier goals of myself and my partner Pete is what we want to do is we want to bring manufacturing back to America. That's what we want to do. And in order to do that, you got to grow. And there's some risk involved when you grow. But if you do it, like I said, in a measured way with iterative steps, that's the best way to do it. That way you can deliver products that people want. And so originusa.com, jockofuel.com, check out those businesses. Echelonfront.com while we're at it.
Okay, last question. And I think this is an important one, especially in today's political climate. Again, most of my audience is listening for, they're interested in policy, they're interested in politics. How do you engage in dialogue or debate with very emotional people who are angry? And I get asked this question all the time, and I'm going to give you some of my answer, and maybe it'll spark some thoughts. But some of my answer is often, there's some people that you should just walk away from, right? Sometimes it's not worth a debate or a discussion because it's not going to go anywhere. And beyond that, you have to assess them individually on what they care about and what you can connect with. But what's your thoughts on that, and how often does that happen to you?
It definitely happens to me. I travel a lot. I work with a lot of different companies. I can tell you that the vast majority of Americans, when you talk to them, what do they want to talk about? They want to talk about their business. They want to talk about the economy. They want to talk about how they can grow their business, how they can take care of their team. I've got incredible businesses myself, and we're not talking about politics. We got factories in Maine and a factory in North Carolina where we're bringing manufacturing back to America, and bringing jobs back to communities that were decimated when I was growing up. So most people, they are not on these fringe areas where they're going to get hyper emotional. to get to your question of how do you deal with someone that's hyper emotional, that has a very dug in, there's two things I'm going to say. Actually, I guess it's maybe three, a little bit related. The first thing, and one of the most underrated tools of leadership, is to listen. Is to listen to what people have to say. Listen to what their viewpoints are, and actually truly try and understand what their perspective is. And as you listen to someone, there's another technique that I talk about, and I talk about it in the book, Leadership Strategy and Tactics. It's something I call reflect and diminish. Reflect and diminish is, Dan, if you come into my office and you're yelling about something, and my reaction is say, hey, Dan, you need to calm down.
That's not going to make me calm down.
It's not going to make you calm down. As a matter of fact, it creates a divide between us, because now I'm telling you to calm down. That means I don't understand what you're mad about. That means you're on one side, I'm on the other side, we're enemies. So when you come in and you say, Jocko, the supply department didn't give us the boots we need for this trip. And I go, hey, Dan, calm down. All of a sudden, what do you mean calm down? We need these boots. And we're not moving towards a solution. So if I reflect a little bit of your emotion, but diminish it, take it down a notch. Jocko, the supply department didn't give us these boots we're supposed to have for this trip. And I say, I can't believe that. We're definitely going to need those things. How many boots short are they? And all of a sudden, I'm on your side, and we can start having a real discussion about it. Now, that's sort of a tactical thing to do. It's sort of a pragmatic, hey, I'm interacting with one person, that, let's say, at a work issue. But even with a political discussion that you and I are going to have, most people, do they want the economy to do well? Yes, they do. Do they want people to not be starving? Yes, no one wants other people to starve in our own country. Do they want people to have basic health care? Do you want people to be, dying out in the streets? No one wants people dying in the streets. So really, there's a lot of things that we can agree on. Now, is it possible that you're dealing with someone that is not aligned at all, that truly wants to, destroy America and thinks America's evil? Could you be dealing with someone like that? Yeah. Now, if someone tells me America's evil, I have to listen to them. America's done some evil things in its history. Absolutely. You're right. I had somebody confront me about some of the Abu Ghraib stuff. And, in my mind, and I was discussing this guy who's like, well, what about happened in Abu Ghraib? This was a war crime. And I said, hey, Abu Ghraib was awful. I said, but actually, if you want to talk about war crimes, let's talk about the My Lai Massacre. Let's talk about the Sand Creek Massacre. America's done way worse things than Abu Ghraib. So you're right. America has done evil things. What was the intention behind these things? How did they happen? What made them unfold? Were they on purpose? Was the intent behind them to do something horrible and evil? And let's have a discussion about that. But for me to say, no, America is perfect, that's not true. America's not perfect. So if I actually listen to what someone has to say, there's a pretty good chance that we might be aligned on some things. We might be aligned on a lot of things. In fact, we might be just straight up aligned, but we just have different ways of getting there. Somebody thinks that the best way to get the most people health care is to give free health care to everybody. And someone else might think that's a really bad idea. We should just have complete private health care. Both those people want people to be taken care of. So let's discuss, okay, well, we both want people to be taken care of. Let's discuss how to best get that done. And there's probably some compromises that we need to make, because there's some people that can't afford health care. And there's some institutions that if you privatize them, they're going to do a lot better. And there's some institutions that if you put them into the social network, they're going to fall apart. So I think listening to people, and then the last thing I was going to say is asking earnest questions. Asking earnest questions, not gotcha questions. Not gotcha questions, but an earnest question of well, do you think that America, like when Rwanda happened, do you think America should have gone into Rwanda? and stopped the slaughter of 800,000 Tutsis? Do you think that America should have done something there? That's an earnest question. And you know what? I don't know the right answer to that. I can go both ways. Yeah. I can tell you 800,000 people dead by machetes in 100 days is something that I feel like maybe we have a moral obligation to go and try and stop. Does that make us the world police? Does that mean we should go in everywhere? No, absolutely not. But let's discuss. Maybe we can come up with some ideas around how we make decisions as a country.
And let's not pretend that those answers are black and white, which is our biggest problem with political discussions these days. It's like if you get nuanced, you will get attacked. I tell people, I try to unveil the problems with politics to people. And because everybody wants to say, well, it's the snake pit in Washington, D.C., and they'll use terms like that. And I'm like, what does that mean? Let's unravel that a little bit. The problem is incentive structures. And people don't want to hear that. But the problem is incentive structures where politicians who try to have nuanced discussions, and I do. I mean, that's why I do this podcast. And I get attacked like hell for it sometimes because people will try to twist something and they want to create a black and white dichotomy because black and white dichotomies are comfort zones for people, right? I can be here and you're there and it's bad versus good. And like, that's what it is. And that can apply to left-right discussions, or it could apply to right-on-right discussions. I think lately I've been in controversy a lot because I've been dealing with my own side because people have this incentive to stake out something for themselves, even if they don't even disagree with me fundamentally. I mean, we really don't. But people have this incentive to stake something out because it helps you one-up somebody. And it's toxic. And I can say the only way to stop it, frankly, is for the American people to stop reacting to it and to stop supporting it. And like to take a step back. I mean, I write about this, like stop just reading the headlines. Got to go a little deeper. You got to ask those questions that you're talking about. What do you mean by this? What's the overall intent? Like what exactly are we saying here? How does this apply to the principles that we do hold dear and won't change? But people don't think through that all the time. Yeah, and it's a horrible situation, and that's why we got to develop relationships with other people. And one of the best ways to do that is listen to what they have to say. And this is something I talk about with leadership. If you want someone to listen to you, listen to them. If you want to influence someone, then allow them to influence you. If you want someone to trust you, then you have to put some trust into them. And if you want to be treated with respect, then you have to give people respect. And all those things rely on you being humble enough to listen to what they have to say, humble enough to treat them with respect, humble enough to allow them to influence you to say, you know what? I might be a little bit wrong on this particular topic, or I can at least see that a compromise would move us forward instead of me sitting here saying, no, I won't compromise. We're not going to do anything. So it's hopefully the next phase of social media, which again, social media to me it's all people are making the statements that you're talking about because it's the best way to get reactions. It's the best way to get likes. It's the best way to get retweets and whatever else you get. Yep. Whereas what ideally what you say, and that's why, some of my podcasts are 5 hours long, 4 hours long, 3 hours long, because we're going to go deep and explore why these decisions were made, why things happened, how they unfolded. And that's what you need to do. And that's what you need to do with these political discussions, which was the original question. How do I deal with someone that's super emotional and has a hardcore opinion about something? I'm going to listen to what they have to say. I'm going to ask them earnest questions, not gotcha questions, but earnest questions. And I'm going to look for areas where we might be aligned, where we can find some common ground, where we can start to move forward. I've said this before. If you have nothing in common with me, then you're like a Taliban, or maybe you're just a dyed-in-the-wool communist, and you just hate. If you absolutely hate America and you hate freedom, then maybe I'm going to have a hard time finding common ground. But if you're a normal human being that has normal goals to have a job, to raise a family, to be positive, to make a positive impact in your business and your community,
I can find some common ground with you. And you know what's credible? Echelon Front, we work with so many different businesses. We work with businesses all over the country, all over the world. We work from the oil fields in North Dakota and Texas to the Silicon Valley tech companies. And guess what? The leadership principles, the common ground, it's always there. It's always there. And that's what you got to look for. Listen to what other people have to say. Ask earnest questions. Be humble. And that's how you make progress and build relationships with people so you can actually figure out a way to move forward.
That last question was probably the best jumping off point then for, so I think, some of the best advice for the new year. So that was some great stuff. Jocko, I've told you an hour and it's been longer than that. Really appreciate your time. Audience is going to love this one. Thank you very much, Jocko Willink.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dan. Appreciate it.